Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the United Service Institution of India, I extend a very warm welcome to all the distinguished guests present here, members of the diplomatic community, senior officers, veterans, scholars, researchers, members of the USI fraternity, members of the press, and those joining us online for the special hybrid event marking 50 years of the Entebbe rescue operation. 50 years ago, the Israeli Defense Forces carried out one of the most audacious hostage rescue operations in modern military history. The Entebbe operation remains a subject of enduring professional interest for everybody, including soldiers, strategists, intelligence professionals, diplomats, and students of national and international security. What we saw with this operation was the effective implementation of combined political resolve, intelligence preparation, operational courage, long-range air mobility, surprise, precision, and extraordinary leadership under the conditions of grave uncertainty. To set the context for today's deliberations, we will now screen a short film on the operation.
Just after takeoff at 12:30 p.m. local time, the flight was hijacked by two Palestinians from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, External Operations, and by two Germans.
There are 239 hostages at Entebbe, 83 are Israeli.
Crew and passengers of an Air France plane in Entebbe Airport have announced their demands. French authorities have revealed that terrorists holding the hostages from the Air France hijacking have released all the non-Jewish hostages.
A passenger aircraft has been hijacked. 248 passengers, 12 crew members. Hundreds of lives are now bargaining chips. The hostages are trapped inside an airport terminal in a hostile country. 7 terrorists stand between the hostages and freedom. They've issued their demands. Release 53 prisoners or the executions begin. The deadline is approaching. Would you negotiate? Most governments would. Would you release prisoners? Many have. Would you trade lives today for greater danger tomorrow? Now consider this. The airport is protected. The terrorists are armed. A foreign army stands beside them. MiG fighter jets are parked on the run. You have incomplete intelligence and limited time. Your commandos must fly over 4,000 kilometers for nearly 8 hours into hostile territory, and every decision could get innocent people killed. On the night of 3 July 1976, 4 C-130 transport aircraft took off on one of the longest hostage rescue missions in military history. More than 100 Israeli commandos flew over 4,000 kilometers, hugging the Red Sea at barely 30 meters above the water to evade the Dow. Landing at the airport, they raced towards the terminal. The assault would last only 53 minutes. By the time it was over, 102 hostages had been rescued. All 7 hijackers were dead. 45 Ugandan soldiers had been killed. 11 MiG fighter aircraft had been destroyed on ground. Israel had lost just 1 soldier. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan.
Thank you for the attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we will move to the formal discussion for the evening. So I'll introduce you to the panel here. Sorry, sir. His Excellency Ambassador Reuven Azar, Major General Jasjit Singh Nanda, Distinguished Fellow of USI, Mr. Arjun Hardas, India Representative, American Jewish Committee, and Mr. Sandeep Unnithan, Editor-in-Chief, Chakra News, who will be the moderator for the evening. We are also privileged to have joining us online a very special guest, Brigadier General Joshua Shani, the lead pilot of the Entebbe rescue operation. Sir, it is almost an understatement to say that it is our genuine honor to have you here with us for this event. I will now request Vice Admiral Sanjay Singh, DG USI, to deliver the opening address.
His Excellency, Sir Reuven Azar, Major General Yonatan, former GOC AFSOR, Sergeant Hardas, Sandeep, Brigadier General Joshua Shani, privileged to have you on air and online with us. Mike, it's been heard on that side, that's what we told the tech team. It is indeed my proud privilege and pleasure to welcome all of you on this very historic opportunity to look back just 5 decades into a landmark operation that has become a landmark in terms of counter-terrorism the world over. The actions, the speed, the decision-making, the execution, in all of those, we have not seen it replicated in the last 5 decades. In each of these occasions, subsequently, we've had some variations, some changes, but that became the beacon and the gold standard world over of how counter-terrorism operations, especially hostage rescue, could be conducted. As was brought out in the short film, we've had variations. Most countries have had variations, and we ourselves have experienced some challenges along these lines. And hence, there are always enduring lessons. When you look back at that time, in the short period of completing your intelligence preparation of the battlefield, the logistics, the timelines, the training, internal communications, contingencies of the what ifs and the what ifs if what ifs, and yet be able to move in a team that worked seamlessly across and was able to execute what they did. It's worth looking back, as most of us have done every few years, every time we've studied military operations and especially special forces, look back, try to think through, walk through, and today we have a unique opportunity of talking through this operation with a very distinguished panel. So without much further ado, I will hand over to Sandeep Unnithan, analyst, author, military enthusiast, to take the session forward. Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you, Admiral Sanjay. It's actually, there are, as you mentioned, there are rescue operations and there are rescue operations.
But there is one rescue operation which is like the gold standard of literally everything. And we've seen, as the chief mentioned, we've seen variations of Entebbe attempted by many countries. Some have been outright disasters. Some have been nipped even before they began. But, you know, in the minds of everyone over the last 5 decades, Entebbe has been that dream operation where, to give you the figures, you saw that in the film, but I must tell you, for the rescue mission to fly over 4,000 kilometers for hostile airspace, 4,000 kilometers is literally the distance between New Delhi and Tel Aviv. And to fly in complete darkness, carry out a rescue operation, to neutralize that country's air force on the ground, to do battle with the terrorists and soldiers and rescue the hostages with the loss of just one life. Very tragic story of Lieutenant Colonel Netanyahu, which we'll talk about this evening. But also the fact that this is an operation of kind that it's literally the gold standard. You know, and I have General Datta here, being part of the NSG. You know, one of the greatest operations that they've carried out, and he's always told me about Entebbe, and he's of course trained in Israel. So that tells you about how the high standard that we hold this operation in. And you know, for an armed forces kid to grow up, one of the first words that I learned in growing up, one of the first foreign words I learned was Entebbe, and I believe that that's a Swahili word which means chair. Not sure exactly if that's the right translation, but that's the word that everybody grew up with in the 70s and the 80s. Today it's my absolute privilege to be a moderator on a session where we have such a distinguished panel here, all experts in their own fields. And of course, we have that critical person there who actually flew the mission in the lead pilot on that operation, Brigadier General Joshua Shani. And, you know, when I watched all those movies about Entebbe, Rescue at Entebbe, Read on Entebbe, it was always the commandos that were played by all the big Hollywood stars. You know, and, Charles Bronson as Dan Shomeron, Peter Finch is there. All the big stars were played, the commandos were played by big stars. Nobody spoke about the pilots. But that was Hollywood, right? While the commandos were great, what they did was spectacular. It was only when I read Admiral McRaven's book, Spec Ops, I would highly recommend you read that. It's a 1995 book where he actually mentions the role of the pilots and how critical the role of the pilots was to fly in absolute darkness. And there's a quote by Brigadier General Shani in McRaven's book. And there's this a two-line quote. It says that the plan was relatively simple. And it was based on the fact that nobody would think we were crazy enough to fly there. So it would be total surprise. And this is the kind of operation that they've mounted. I mean, it's absolute craziness to think that anyone would fly that far, launch an operation, bring hostages back. And that's one of the reasons that we are here today to commemorate this 50th anniversary of this very unique operation. And of course, I want to start by asking Brigadier General Shani this question. General Shani, what were the greatest technical and human challenges for you to land in total darkness in hostile territory? And did the mission come close to failing at any point?
So since you asked the question a few minutes ago, I try to remember what you asked for. I think I do. Anyway, I think I do. It was, how can you... I'll tell you what we did. We practiced in the Israeli Air Force, in my squadron, a landing on a dark runway. We did practice it about a year before this operation, and we were asked to show it to the commander of the army, the armed forces, and to the commander of the Israeli Air Force. I was asked to demonstrate it because remember, the C-130 was a brand new airplane in the Air Force. There was no experience about how it's being used. So I took the gang, the leadership of the military here, and I took them and demonstrated them in a place in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is, at that time it was part of Israel in South Sinai, to demonstrate them how can it be done. And the way to use it was to use the radar and with the navigator and to navigate the airplane just until it touched down, and they were very impressed.
Yes, 50 years of Entebbe. What are your recollections of Entebbe? What does it mean for Israel? And how has it shaped your response to terrorism, to hostage situations since then, the last 50 years? I understand it came at a time when you were reeling under Yom Kippur, 1973. You had the Savoy Hotel attack, 1975, and this was 1 year after it. How did it shape your response to terrorism?
Well, first of all, we have to, I think, remember the background because, 1976 was a time in which, after almost 30 years of war, conventional war between Israel and the Arab countries around at that time, the Arab countries that attacked us time and again were really trying to annihilate us, and the fact that we managed to overcome the surprise attack of the Yom Kippur War was a major victory that, ultimately only, 2 years, 1 year after that, we had a breakthrough with Egypt and the peace process with Egypt started. So it was a kind of a culmination of an era in which the Arab nationalism, let's say, when it comes to, destroying Israel, basically collapsed. And there was an attempt to renew that momentum by using terrorism, because conventional war wasn't working. And it's not that we didn't have terrorism before, because remember the time of the Fidayun in the 50s, and attempts, killings against civilians, etc. But the terrorism on airplanes was something really extraordinary. Shook the world. And the challenge was to try to see how you can deal with people that don't respect norms, because the conventional wars were difficult, were devastating, but there was a code. There was some kind of a code, and the terrorists used a new type of warfare that doesn't respect norms, doesn't respect humanity, doesn't respect civilians, and then in order to defeat it, you have to be much more creative. And I think this is one of the reasons that Entebbe is so well remembered, because you have to be very creative and you have to manage to create surprise and actually target the terrorists in a way that doesn't require only necessarily conventional methods. Because you couldn't, in order to rescue hostages, to go and conquer entire countries. I think this is what is unique. The proof, I think, for the first time, that you can defeat terrorism. You have to be very creative about it, but you don't have any choice, because the alternative is to surrender to terrorism. And we've seen, although we had a policy of not negotiating, we saw that throughout history after that, we had to negotiate in many instances with terrorists because we didn't have the capacity, the creativity, the ingenuity to actually defeat them in an unconventional way. So I think that Entebbe set the example that things like that are possible. You can actually try to prevent total war while targeting terrorists in a way that will lead to less collateral damage. So this is what's very unique, and I think it set the example for all counter-terrorism forces around the world.
Absolutely. The gold standard of counter-terrorism operations that they're talking about. Arjun Hardas, who's actually put this event together, and it was Arjun's idea that we started. It actually began with a idea of doing a podcast with Jasjit. Arjun, you want to comment on Entebbe, what it means? You have a very interesting backstory on Entebbe, right?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Sandeep. First, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Air Vice Marshal Mike Fernandez, who's also the country head for Lockheed Martin, the aircraft that manufactured the C-130, which Israel used for the rescue. And the same C-130 with the Indian Air Force was also used in Operation Kaveri, where hostages, where civilians were rescued from Sudan just 3 years ago. The same aircraft. Mike Fernandez. Yes. Thank you. The background is a little interesting. Is that I turned 54 this year, and my father's from the Air Force, and we were at an extremely isolated place, which only the Air Force will know, military will know, about a place called Tezpur Air Force Station. And on my birthday, my parents, things were not available those days in the 70s. And much afterwards, maybe 4 or 5 days after my birthday, I was having a tantrum, basically. I wanted more party, where's the cake, etc. And I had gone to somebody's house as a 4-year-old. And I remember seeing a newspaper lying there, probably dated 5th of July, 1976. And one word that stuck out to me, and I was 4, I was not much into reading at that point, was Israel. So that was the Times of India report on the Entebbe raid, which stuck in my mind. And 50 years later, we are here. I belong to the American Jewish Committee. I'm the country representative for India and South Asia. We work on working for the well-being of the Jewish people globally, not just in the state of Israel, but globally. We're based in New York, are headquartered in New York. And this is something which AJC was, this program, this whole hostage situation AJC has been dealing with for decades. We are a 120-year-old organization. And this was when Sandeep and I, and then Admiral Singh and I discussed this, the idea was to talk about how even after 50 years, the situation is getting worse where Jews are getting targeted. Lessons are not, there is terrorism, hostage situations, etc. We said, let's revive this. Let's give Ambassador, you will remember that between 1972 and 1976, it was completely bad news, literally every other day, every other month. There was Malot and other kinds of incidents. 76, the rescue at Entebbe turned the fortunes of Israel around. It gave a boost to the morale of the people of Israel and the Jews worldwide. 1967 was, of course, a fantastic year, but the Jewish people were a country which was tiny at that point, became almost 5 times the original land that was given by the United Nations, became 5 times. It was a boost for the Jewish people after the Holocaust, 25 years after the Holocaust. So Yom Kippur War in 73 was not a good one for the Jewish people. 76, and the terror attacks. You had the Munich attacks, the terror attacks. You had rampant terrorism, which the ambassador has mentioned. Every other month there was something or the other. And 76 happened. Entebbe happened. It gave such a boost to the Jewish people that we are no longer the victims, as they would say. Now we don't wait to be saved. We take the initiative. We go ahead and look after the Jewish people without asking other people to help us or to sacrifice their lives or to do anything that we cannot do. It was a mind change, a psychological difference which happened to the Jewish people and the state of Israel, which demonstrated, as they've said, no longer a nation that dwells alone. So that is something which has stayed in my mind. I've tried when I was in Israel a number of times to meet General Shani, and we coming from the Air Force family, as I said, it's one of those things where many people in Israel, if you mention today who was the pilot who went, people don't know. Yonatan Netanyahu, all honor to him, he deserves his recognition. Who was the pilot? Who took him there? No rescue without the pilots. And he was how old? 29 years old, a squadron commander of the C-130s. Took the responsibility, went in, as he himself used to say, that he's the only one who was told by the commanders that don't tell your family what's happening, where are you going. Keep it completely secret. Nobody should know this. And he did not. When he came back, and he will tell us the story, when he came back, it turns out every other pilot had told their families and their wives except him. So his wife was quite upset. And this is something which caught my imagination years ago, Operation Kaveri, where not many people know this. Not people know this. Not many people have this, know about this, where a C-130, the Indian Air Force,
Power on.
if I remember correctly, launched from Saudi Arabia,
Bluetooth mode.
from there, went to Sudan, guided by the defense attaché there in Sudan, by the air attaché, found an abandoned runway somewhere outside Khartoum, which was not operational, no lights, nothing. Using night vision goggles, our C-130 pilots landed at night, guided literally only by night vision goggles, rescued about 60, 80, or over 100, if I remember correctly, civilians in, guarded by Garud commandos, loaded them back in, take off again at night, again night vision goggles, and brought them back to safety. It's a great endorsement of the C-130, of course, but you see how the commonalities are there, how we all have to work together. The memory has to be kept alive, that this is possible, that we can work together and we can find common objects to work together. Israel and the United States and India have been working together, a lot of things which we don't know ourselves. The ambassador will know better in the defense field, etc., how we are all working together. But this is the prime example, and I wanted to bring this out. Let's not forget this happened. In a few decades, the principles will not be there alive anymore, but they should not be forgotten. That this is one example of how when the will of the nation is there and the armed forces will deliver. That's why I wanted to bring in General Shani. I wanted people to hear directly what he has to say.
Let's hear from
yeah.
Shani, Arjun. You mentioned Operation Kaveri, but you had night vision goggles.
Yes.
Shani, 50 years back had nothing.
Yep.
It's literally,
And Sandeep, one slight sentence. I would also like to name somebody who passed away just recently, a member of the Sayeret Matkal, who was the Special Forces under Netanyahu, who went to Entebbe. My colleague's father, whom until the day, unfortunately, when he passed away, Staff Sergeant Asaf Lipman from the Israeli army, from the Sayeret, until he passed away, his daughter said he didn't want anybody to know. And we used to say, Dad, talk about this. You went to Entebbe. You were the Special Forces. You were Sayeret Matkal. He says, no, I just did my duty. I don't want to talk about it.
So, back to your story about landing in Entebbe in pitch darkness. How did you prepare for this? I mean, like you told Admiral Reuven, the plan was relatively simple. It was based on the fact that nobody would think we were crazy enough to fly there. So it would be total surprise. How did you do this?
I'm not sure I understood every word you said, but I'm repeating what I said earlier, assuming that it did not go well. We practice this technique of dark landing, let's call it this way, which means to land on a runway without runway lights. We did not know if the Ugandans will keep the lights on at midnight, which was the time that we landed, or not. So we practiced this, nothing to do with Entebbe, but when we were asked to do it, the government or the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the Air Force asked us, please show us that you can really do it. They didn't know that we have this capability, and I had to demonstrate it. And I will not waste time with you on telling you about the technique, but it was based on using the radar. The radar normally can see the differences between the runway and the surrounding around, which bring back different picture to the scope. So based on this, a navigator that use it can tell me, the pilot, say, now 2 degrees to the right, 2 degrees to the left. Now you should descend 500 feet more. Approach and to touchdown. So I did this demonstration a night before the operation itself, one night before, and it was successful. And the leadership, it wasn't easy for me to fly an airplane at night with breathing on my neck is my boss and my boss's boss and everybody there. It wasn't a very pleasant situation, but it worked pretty good. And eventually we did not use it because the runway lights were on and we landed like a normal landing without landing lights. The navigator did exactly what he was trained to do, just in case somebody will switch off the lights, which then didn't happen, and we landed safely like this. That was my answer to you about the dark landing, as we call it.
Shani, a quick follow-on question before I bring General Nanda. Why this operation was on? It was the command. You were on the ground for what, 90 minutes or so, less than 100 minutes. And there was gunfire going on. There were rocket launchers being fired. Recoilless rifles were being fired. There was mayhem all around. And you were in the cockpit of that aircraft. What were your thoughts then? I mean, what were you? Were you running a checklist? Did you know what was going on, for instance? Whether the hostages were being rescued. What were your thoughts at that moment?
Okay, here is my answer. First of all, remember, it was a one-way trip. We did not have fuel to fly back to Israel. We did not. It was just one way. We needed to refuel the aircraft, either in Entebbe or in another place, which was not specified at that stage. So the first thing we did, we were very busy to find a way to connect to the fuel system of Entebbe Airport and to start refueling the aircraft. So since I landed by myself, my crew immediately started to look at the way to refuel. But as you mentioned, it was not very pleasant because the shooting started very early at the stage, and it was tracers which can actually see the bullets around you. And even though I had my bullet-proof vest and 2 guns and the Uzi, you cannot fight against the fighter. So I said it wasn't unpleasant. So we were looking for the better alternative was to get the hell out of there and land somewhere else and do the refueling. So I cannot say that I was thinking a lot at that time. It was 50 minutes, maybe 55 minutes or something like this. We were in communication all the time. We had the command and control that flew 100 miles from us with the commander of the Israeli Air Force that asked questions. And he eventually told us Nairobi option is open. So you can land there and get some fuel there. We're very happy to collect everybody back, the hostages and the soldiers. We counted them 20 times, not to leave anybody behind, and took off to the next point was Nairobi.
Right, absolutely. Which helped that. Kenya was one of the countries that was friendly to Israel. So it always helps to have diplomatic ties with countries like that in areas of your interest. And I was actually speaking with General Nanda just before, talking about this operation. And General Nanda is the person who operationalized our AFSOR, Armed Forces Special Operations Division. He did a lot of very interesting things. a lot of things he's not clear to talk about. But I want to ask you about this particular operation, Nanda. You followed Entebbe very closely. How would you do this kind of an operation today? Given the fact that 50 years back, you didn't have social media, right? How would you do this in an era of social media where there's literally no, privacy? There's, your OPSEC is so compromised. There's a lot of pressure on you. This kind of an operation, how would you do it?
See, special operations will remain a challenge always. You're getting into a hostile terrain, and you got to be operating there. And you need to have assured success because that's why it's called special. That's why it's called special. Okay, because you can't afford to fail. Okay. The challenge today, and it's very evident. What you see, I look at Israel. The continuous series of special operations that they continue to succeed in the terrain that they operate today, in hostile terrain. And take the example of pagers going off. In the recent Iran war, all people being together and targeted at that particular time. Okay, so there are people who are still thinking ahead. The issue is how do you remain creative and continue to be creative to be able to surprise your enemy. That's a challenge. It will remain. And in this era, movement and aircraft takes off from anywhere. A ship moves from any harbor. Okay, it's being monitored. Yet to be able to achieve, yes, there are challenges. But we have live examples. If I look at this operation 50 years back, there were some principles that came out from this list. And one thing which was very evident was this issue about a national will and the risk ability of the national leadership. You imagine getting into a country where you're looking at going on a one-way ticket, and yet the nation is not ready to go down, risk it, and succeed. First issue is about the national will and the resolve, and they continue to demonstrate that today. The lessons from there very evident. I'll draw the lessons from what we take from Entebbe and relate it to today. Okay, national will we spoke about. Intelligence fusion. Today you have intelligence from multiple sources. How do you integrate that? You've got satellite. Most important as I look at from an Israeli perspective, from the recent successes, is this issue of human end. You have assets in the areas of interest. Wherever the areas of interest are, it's not limited to the geography immediately, the neighboring countries. It's an area of interest, and they've been able to create assets and utilize assets as and when required. But also draw something again from here. There's something called strategic patience. Once you decide that I have got to achieve this military objective for the nation, it may take 10 years building that capacities. But they build that capacities. Look at the way they recovered the nuclear material. It took almost 10 years of preparation, and yet they recovered. Okay, so special operations are and will continue to be very relevant. The lessons of Entebbe, go through each lesson is speak, as important as it was then. Only things, the dynamics have changed, and all you need to look at, from a special operations capability, any nation looking at that. Look at Israel, what it continues to do with continued success. And in the recent past, if you look at the last decade, you will not find a single failure. And the challenge today with human rights, with the precision targeting that's required, intelligence, fusion, social media, yet they continue to succeed. These are models that we need to continue to study. And the lessons from 5 decades back are as relevant, but they need to be modified and refined as it goes along.
Take on what you said about the lessons from there. I want to go back to Azar. Excellency, the hijackers have demanded the release of prisoners in multiple countries. And of course, Israel decided that they want to go for the military option. And you put that plan together in 48 hours. I think it's one of the fastest executed operations. And literally, when the plane was hijacked, You had Sarat Matkal that was already, the clock was ticking and they were already planning and stuff. So, I mean, that's why it's, again, gold standard. But what were the diplomatic risks of going through with an operation like this? This is an operation literally at every point you could have had a failure. A plane could have been stranded. We've seen that happening with Claw just a few years after, right? In the desert, we know what happened. One plane crashed into a helicopter, all of that. Your allies, the Americans, tried to replicate that with a lot of, it was disappointing, it was a disaster. But what were the diplomatic risks that Israel undertook in 76 by proving this operation?
Yeah, well, there are always huge risks, first of all, to human life, and therefore leadership has to bear responsibility. At the end of the day, you can have very creative, imaginative, and brave soldiers and generals, but the politicians have to make a decision. And this decision could bear terrible consequences in terms of, first of all, human life, but also when it comes to diplomacy. We've seen, for example, what happens when operations fail. Take, for example, what happened with Khalid Mash'al in 96. We had a very delicate and very fresh peace agreement with Jordan. And actually, the operation, the Khalid Mash'al operation, almost finished our peace agreement with Jordan. We had a huge crisis with the UAE, with Mabhouh. So, and there were different complications with friendly countries like Australia, countries in Europe, when we decided to take action without full consent of the host government. So yes, of course, there are always risks. At the end of the day, you have to balance everything, to measure everything. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. But you have to take into account that at some point you're going to fail, because otherwise you won't take the risk to do anything.
As they say in the Special Forces score is who dares wins. I think that's the thing. I think we have that in one of our Special Forces as well, Sahas Ki Vijay. That's the translation in Hindi. Yeah. But I'm going to request General Shani if you can come back in. Welcome back, sir. You've been hearing our panelists talk about Entebbe. Looking back at it, tell us again on the way back. Everyone knows how you went in and you spent those anxious moments on the ground. Tell us about the return from Entebbe. When you went to Kenya, you refueled over there, and then you flew back. Did you again think that there was something that could hold you back, or you thought it was mission accomplished then?
Remember, on the way back, if that's what you asked, we still had to fly between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and this is before the peace treaty that Israel had with Egypt. So there was still some uncomfortable flying there with the heavy C-130s, formation of 4, and so the Israeli Air Force decided to send like 4 Phantoms F4s to meet us halfway. They couldn't do it all the way, but they did it to the border of Sudan and Egypt and escorted us. We did not violate any international water or international air, but still it was a war situation between Egypt and Israel, and we wanted what happened on the flight, because it was 8 hours to fly back home. And during these 8 hours, we were listening on the HF radio to the Israeli broadcasts. And Peres, the Minister of Defense at that time, later Prime Minister, and the President started to admit that yes, the Israeli Special Forces are on the way back. So there was lots of excitement in the cockpits. I turned on the loudspeakers for the Sayeret Matkal, for the Special Forces, to listen, and you could see that the people that were interviewed and talked did not believe this is true. They thought it's kind of a BS story. How can it be? And so there was lots of excitement, but the most excitement for me was after I landed and the kids from the neighborhood waited next to my home with flowers in their hand and greeted me. And the top of it was when I got back home, and my father, who was a survivor from the Holocaust, I personally spent 1.5 years in Bergen-Belsen in Germany, was and people were gathering all together in my home, and I felt that he gained a few years of his life just by being part of this great moment. That's not exactly, that was a good answer. What was the question?
Doesn't matter to Shani. Thank you, but since we've got a good line, I must ask you one quick follow-up question, and that relates to Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, one of the bravest officers and the most inspirational figures, I would think, of the 20th century. He would have turned 80 in March this year. But tell us about your recollections of who we call Yoni Netanyahu. What kind of an officer was he? How well did you know him? And what did you feel at that moment when you realized that he was the only casualty? He was the commander of the Seret Matkal, and he was the only casualty, the military casualty of that operation.
Yes. First of all, there was another one, a guy named soldier named Sorin Hershko, which I met about an hour ago, and he was a superb guy that very, very badly wounded. About Yoni, I knew him. I met him a couple of times. I met him like 2 or 3 times during the preparation to the mission. He was a cool guy. He was not excited at all. And he was talking to me details about things that we should talk to each other, not without the big bosses around us. And we coordinated things. And then when flew in the cockpit itself, there is a bed. In the C-130 Hercules cockpit, there's a bed. Normally, the pilots are using it to rest when they have long trip. This time I found him lying there when I was looking for a place for myself to rest a little bit before the landing, and he was there. I gave him personally 50% chance not to survive it, because he was the first one that will storm the terminal. And that's what I thought. I thought to myself, this is probably his chances to stay alive are 50%. So I didn't have the heart to wake him up. So what I did, I crawled next to him, it's a very short, small bed, and I just tried to close my eyes next to his nose to nose, but I couldn't do it, and left him. So unique guy, superb leader, and justifiably the operation is called after his name.
But I want to come back to before we open the floor to questions. Arjun, big lesson Entebbe for the world. What do you think is the biggest lesson?
The biggest lesson in 1976, the biggest lesson from that continuous is yes, we can. Terrorism is not there. The fear was always that how can we fight against terrorism? It's an ideology. They were more manpower, they are military, whichever. Whether it was the Egyptians. As a matter of fact, the slow connection is that, the slight connection is that in 1972, when all this happened, the Munich massacre, when Munich massacre happened in 1972, the Germans' response was, let's put it politely, useless. Germans did not have special forces, special police, and army to be able to handle the terror. They just didn't know what it was. They tried, but it was just useless. And that gave rise to their own special forces called the GSG-9, which, taking a lesson from Entebbe, in 1979 there was a Azar aircraft that was hijacked to Somalia. And this was the first time that taking lessons from this, that it is possible. They moved in and rescued the Lufthansa passengers, etc. We have had our own different, most of them we don't know, and we will know better. We have had our own successes in these kind of things. The inspiration factor. That now we don't have to sit back. Any army, not just Israel or India or Germany or any country. Inspiration, if they can do it, we can do it. And they don't have to hide anymore. We have to get into their into their backyard, hit them, rescue our people, get them back. And we can do it. That is the biggest takeaway from
Absolutely. And I was just looking at Dushyant and Dutta here, who are both from the NSG, and they handled very critical operations. NSG is, of course, model of the DSP-9. Dushyant was the first commander during Pathankot, and Jen Dutta was Black Thunder and many other operations. Nanda wanted to make a point.
The two of us here, the 88 on campus, we had something similar, not at that scale, and years back. We landed at the holiday field, similar condition. Getting into a terrain which was a field which you not sure who's holding. Anyone who's known about holiday, you would realize that landing there with crosswinds is a challenge in its own sense. Living without legs is the classification which I had for Azar. What goes into the mind of a pilot who's leading, the commander who's in the aircraft, that is Usara and
Look at Babu were there. The decision to go and land, because the alternate plan was to do paragraph the next day. Okay. But the decision, it's always that critical decision that decides. And the risk, I keep going back to this. Special forces are all about the degree of risk that you're able to take. And that's what, it's not the training. It's a mental orientation that happens in a training basis somewhere. But, and if you have a commander, and if you have a national leadership with clear clarity, you can deliver. Thank you.
Okay. Jim Shani, if you're there with us, any closing comments on this historic day, 50 years of Entebbe? Any thoughts that you might want to share with us here?
I want to relate to a remark made earlier about the time that we chose to land in Entebbe. I think you mentioned this subject. And when we looked for the time to land, we looked at the international flights to Entebbe, and we wanted to pick up a landing and a takeoff, which has like an hour difference between them, so to allow us to sneak in quietly between two international travels there. It was not so important the exact time, but it was important not to bump into a British Airways or Kenya Airways or whatever in the time. So we picked up the time. It was not so important exactly. But luckily, pure luck, I found out that I landed about 30 seconds, either earlier or late from the time. I learned this from a CBS Evening News, a guy named Tom Fendon at that time, that interviewed me maybe a year later, maybe a few months later, and he asked me, how did you handle such a long flight to land 30 seconds off time? Which I didn't have a clue that was the case. So he caught me unprepared, and my answer to him was, well, I guess God worked overtime that night.
Once again, I want to thank the US side and Sanjay Singh for hosting this event. It was Arjun, Hardas, BBC, Excellency, Ambassador Reuven Azar for being here this evening. What a wonderful discussion it has been. It's eye-opening. Every time I go back to Entebbe, I learn something new. And of course, having Brigadier General Shani joining us, I mean, it's such an honor. I can't tell you that. And, of course, Nanda, good to be back again. So we've done some great things together in the past. And Nanda was DA Bangladesh, and he was extremely helpful for a book that I wrote on one of the greatest Indian special forces operations, Operation Entebbe, conducted by the Indian Navy. So, on that note, I hand it over back to Richa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would like to thank the panel for the discussion today, and it would not be right, but I think we would describe this one as a brief session today, because I'm sure everybody will be curious and have a lot of questions. So before we move towards the conclusion, I want to apologize for the mistakes that happened with the technology today, but it seems like it has a mind and mood of its own, which we can't help with. Before the conclusion of the ceremony today, sir, I would like to extend thanks to everybody and call DG USI to deliver the closing remarks for the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, you will agree with me that this has been a very engrossing afternoon. 50 years of Entebbe. Every year, military students all over the world been studying it. 365 into 50. So many lessons, enduring lessons, which will never change. So much of inspiration, so much of variation, so much of what ifing. Some of us constantly thinking, if I were there, would I have been able to do this? Could I do it? How should I do it? What will change? What are the problems? It's impossible to sum up this kind of an operation and indeed this kind of a discussion with personal insights from the man who led the aircraft in on a dark night, thinking through each of these issues that I just mentioned. The skill, the background capability, risk-taking we've spoken about, but finally results or relies upon the capability which gives the confidence to take the risk. Otherwise, it's blind risk. So if I were to take three things and only three things, and I always say three because for a military mind, it's easy to count to three. The first would be what Arjun Hardas said, drawing inspiration. Yes, we can. Related to that, capability building, yes, we will. Spoken about Germans, spoke about the Indian SF, the NSG. Building up that capability is the start point of building up the confidence. That is what leads to the second one, which is the ability to take risks, the ability to accept risks. It relies upon the inspiration and the capability to develop in the first place. And finally, it always matters on the third thing, readiness of the force. Plan, prepare, practice, back to planning, again preparing, again practice, again and again and again, till the moment comes when you again have to improvise, adapt, and go in and execute. So if there are three things I would take away from this timeless operation at Entebbe, it would be these three things. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us at the United Service Institution for our absolutely engrossing discussion, and my compliments to the panel. And General Shani, thank you so much for joining us online. Please join me in a round of applause for all the panelists.